Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. We're glad to have you all here. My name is Elna Dam, and I'm a dual trainee in intensive care medicine and anesthesia, and I'm the trainee lead for environmental sustainability at the Intensive Care Society. I'm co-chairing this event today together with Dr. Heather Bates, who is a principal lecturer at the University of Brighton and is the research collaboration lead for the Green ICU project. Today's session is the first of 7 we're running in the run up to COP26, dedicated to climate change and how we can make changes on a personal, professional and political level at a pace and scale required. Our first session today is about improving our carbon literacy, understanding what climate change looks like and what it is doing to the planet. We've got 3 fantastic speakers lined up for you today, all of whom are experts in their field, and they will speak to you about climate change from various different angles. Also hoping to understand where our carbon emissions come from in a bit more detail, from everyday items and linking that right way through all the way to the healthcare provision. Some general housekeeping rules. At the bottom of your screen, you'll have a Q&A box. Please feel free to put any questions in there and we will address them at the end of our speakers. Without further ado, I will pass over to Antony Turner, who's the director and co-founder of Real World Visuals. Real World Visuals specialize in data visualization, helping organizations to see the real impact of numbers that may otherwise be difficult to interpret. And today, Antony will help us understand and visualize our carbon output as individuals and as a collective. Antony, over to you. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I'm okay now. Okay. Thanks very much. I've been involved in helping people and organizations understand and engage with climate change issues for 20 years. Let me just share my screen and I will put that on and do that. Yeah, so it's a privilege really to be asked to talk to you. You know, you people have been so amazing over the last 2 weird and extraordinary years. I asked myself, why would climate change be an issue to you as busy and probably exhausted health professionals? And maybe the answer is that there is a connection between wanting to heal and care for people and a desire for a healthy planet. So I want to start by posing this question. You know, what if the planet we call home, what if the Earth itself is in some sense alive? What if the living Earth is now suffering from a fever brought about by our carbon emissions? What if the virus is us, 20th century humans? In order to respond to such a maybe strange suggestion, I think we all need to develop something that I would call carbon literacy. Carbon literacy is the ability to understand carbon implications of our actions in the landscape of our lives. But there is a problem. Carbon dioxide and methane are invisible. We don't see them, so we don't think they're real. So we carry on with business as usual. This is a story I've been telling for many years when I first started doing this. And it's a place called Vostok. You can just see, it's not a very brilliant picture. This is in the Antarctic, and it's the coldest place on the planet. Back in the 70s, a bunch of Russian and French scientists got together to drill through the ice in this place in the Antarctic. And the data that they pulled up from these ice cores actually gave interesting things going back in time 400,000 years. And essentially they showed the temperature change from the present over the last, that period of time. And you can see really most of the time we've been much lower temperatures. So these are the ice ages. And occasionally we've gone up and had these interglacials, warm periods, and then quite quickly gone back down again. But they were also able to work out through clever methods that I'm not going to explain now, the CO2 level in the atmosphere at that time. And it's varied between 200 and 300 parts per million. So, you know, I think there's just a kind of simple question to ask. Anybody see any relationship between temperature of planet and CO2 level in atmosphere? And that's not to say that one causes the other, but as a non-scientist, it seems to me there's a rather clear relationship here. And if I then see that button, you can see that we have gone off scale in terms of what we put into the atmosphere in the last 150 years. And a lot of that really in the last 20 years. Is that coming up? So over the last year, 8 years or so, I focused really on what I think is this important part, which is trying to make carbon visible. And I started by forming a joint venture with some others, which we called Carbon Visuals. That's now turned into this business called Real World Visuals. And this is a picture of my granddaughter some years ago. She's 21 now. That's a kilo of CO2 would take up a 1 meter diameter bubble. And so really it's a simple way of changing the metric. You know, the accounting of carbon is done in kilos of tons and millions of tons, but actually we never see it. So if we can start to make it visible, that might help people engaged. Not changing slides.
I think you may have just muted yourself, Antony.
The trouble is, yeah. So this is a film that we did a few years ago, and this is an extract showing the carbon footprint of the planet. Okay. That gives you an idea of the kind of scale. So one of the things we like to do is show things in real time, and showing stuff in real time and changing the scale from annual as well can really help us. This is just something we've just done recently, showing what, for instance, the amount of CO2 that currently, this is really pretty current, and maybe 2 or 3 years ago, that you know, one oil company, if you like, is in some sense responsible for. We're all responsible for this, but this is coming from the stuff that they get out of the ground. We changed the scale a little bit. We come down to a city. We did a film 7 or 8 years ago showing New York City's carbon footprint, and it went viral, and it was the time of Hurricane Sandy. We didn't in that film, I'm not going to show the whole film, just a little extract, but we didn't say this is about climate change. We just said, this is the carbon footprint. This is what it would look like if you could see the emissions from all the buildings and all the transport in a city like New York. And by putting it in the landscape of which it originates, it gives us a better sense. It somehow, I think, makes that real. This one is something we've done very recently to try and get the UK government to take a notice of the emissions and you know, the coal itself that would be coming out of the ground if they give the go-ahead to a new coal mine in Cumbria. It's not designed for energy production, it's for steel making, but nevertheless, it's quite a carbon footprint. So we did this as a little thing just to see if we could focus attention on a particular challenge and see if we could make a difference by getting through to politicians. So we dumped the pile of coal next to the Houses of Parliament to see if that might help. Each of those is a 1 ton bubble. So that's a mountain of 1 ton bubbles. We're pretty careful about the data, so there's just a couple of quick instances there of the data, but we are data visualizers and we try and make sure that the data we get is robust and seriously accurate. Here's a film, one of a set of 3 that we made for an organization called Wood for Good, which was trying to get across the idea that it's very good to build houses with wood because it locks up carbon. So houses can be, if you like, carbon banks, so that they're locking up carbon from the atmosphere, which is collected for us by the trees. So this is just to show what carbon is captured by a single tree, in this case a Sitka spruce grown in a plantation.
We love trees. They keep the atmosphere healthy. They absorb carbon and create the oxygen we breathe. In fact, trees are made of air. Carbon dioxide in the air enters the leaves through tiny holes. It combines with water when sunlight shines on chlorophyll, the green stuff in leaves. The result is food that the tree can use to grow and oxygen for us. This typical tree will have grown to a height of 25 meters in 40 years. By then, the sawn timber produced will have captured this actual volume of carbon dioxide gas from the atmosphere. Every tree absorbs carbon dioxide and stores it as wood. Using trees is good.
So a couple more examples. This one is a little bit more personal. We see that it's now becoming more common for car manufacturers to be making electric cars. We did a little series of images a few years back before VW had done their latest one, but they did have an electric Golf. So we thought it'd be good to actually show the difference between a petrol, a diesel, and an electric Golf that was run off grid electricity. Alternatively, an electric Golf run off green electricity for one of the green electricity suppliers like Good Energy or Ecotricity that is pretty easy to switch to. So here's that difference. So typical mileage of 150 odd miles a week, you'll put out 48 kilos of CO2 if you have a petrol car. A bit less with a diesel, but of course more local air pollution. And then electric, you're halving that using grid electricity. But if you actually go for a green tariff, you're down to a very minimal amount. So that's kind of one of the actions that if one is in the market for a new car, of course, there aren't that many second-hand ones around, that is a really an action that one can take at a personal level. So I just want to end with something that we did, I think 2-3 years ago for Plymouth University for a project called Nurses. And this was showing the amount of CO2 typically that it comes from clinical waste in hospitals. And the idea is to try and get people to see that too much is thrown away into the clinical waste bins that could actually just go into the normal waste, and because the clinical waste is a lot more carbon intensive to burn and so on. So it's just a series of slides that were put into a little animated film. So that's the CO2 emissions from a single bag, and over a kilo. But just under half of that is actually doesn't need to be there. A single bag of clinical waste, just over a kilo, as I said. Daily emissions from a 20-bed neonatal unit, 7. You've got the savings there of 3 kilos, and that's the amount from the hospital in terms of daily emissions just from clinical waste. Put that across the whole of the NHS, you get a tonnage, which is fairly substantial. And if that waste was put in the right bags, you could save 320 tonnes a day. And that's just a final slide to show the NHS England. I think that's probably 2017 or 16 data, 62,000 tonnes of CO2 a day. So that's it. I hope that was interesting, and look forward to some questions later on.
Thank you, Antony, for your really interesting presentation. Our next speaker is Dr. Rosie Oaks, joining us from the Met Office. In her role as a senior scientist, Rosie is perfectly placed to help us better understand the science of climate change, some of its causes, and what it's doing to our planet. Over to you, Rosie. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Heather. And thanks, Antony, for your talk. You've actually set up what I'm going to talk about really well. And I think it's so important when we're facing this climate crisis to work together across disciplines. And I think art and visualization has a huge role to play in that. And scientists maybe traditionally haven't been so good at connecting with that field. And I hope we do a lot more of that in the future. So as Heather mentioned, today I'm going to talk to you about climate change, the science of it, and what our potential futures look like. So let me just move this along. So I figured a good place to start when talking about climate change is just to try and understand the difference between weather and climate. So weather is what you're experiencing right now. So in Exeter right now, it's extremely sunny. There are no clouds in the sky, and yeah, probably wish I was on the beach. That would be a good place to be right now. So that's what's happening at the moment. But when we talk about climate, that's a description of what happens where you are over a longer period of time. And we usually calculate climate over a period of about 30 years. So you might say, well, in Devon in September, it tends to be mild and you'll have sunny days or something, maybe some rain. So that's a description of climate. So another way to think about this, which helps me, is to think about the weather is what you wear. So right now it's sunny. You might wear shorts and a t-shirt or a dress or something. But the climate is what's in your wardrobe. So what are you prepared for over a longer period of time? Maybe you've got jeans and jumpers, coats for the winter, and shorts and a t-shirt for the summer. And when we think about the climate somewhere like Devon, what's in my wardrobe will be very different than somebody who lives in northern Alaska or somebody who lives in the Bahamas. So that's a really good way to think about weather and climate. So what is climate change then? So this is when those long-term weather patterns measured over a 30-year period are shifting. So it's a big long-term change in the conditions that a certain area is experiencing. And as Antony pointed out, you can see this in different ways, and we'll come back to the ice core things that he mentioned previously. But some of the ways that we've noticed that climate is changing is that we've seen a decrease in the Arctic sea ice. So there's been about a 13% decrease per decade since the 1980s. And there's also lots of other temperature records from around the world that show that average global temperature has increased since the 1850s. And the Met Office actually has a dashboard where you can look at all these different data sources. As Antony mentioned, it's really important when we're looking at climate change to make sure that we have good data. And so the Met Office are trying to make sure that that's available to everybody who is interested. So climate change is caused by human emissions. And I think we've really had a great introduction to this from the previous talk. But this graph just shows the concentration of carbon dioxide here on the y-axis over time on the x-axis. And this is measured at Mauna Loa Observatory in Hawaii. And the reason it's measured here is because Hawaii is in the middle of the ocean. And so there's no emissions from factories and stuff nearby. This is thought to be a really good place on Earth to measure it. And what you can see is that carbon dioxide concentrations have increased in the atmosphere over time. And they are increasing at an increasing rate. And so this may look kind of gradual from this graph, but when we compare it to the ice core record, so now again, we have concentration of carbon dioxide on the y-axis, and on the x-axis, we have time. So this is 800,000 years ago, and this is today. And these data come from the ice cores that Antony mentioned in his talk. So scientists take their ice cores and they measure the concentration of carbon dioxide in the bubbles in the ice. It's an insanely cool idea. And they've managed to construct this record for 800,000 years of our history. And you can see that there are some natural cycles over time, but this graph that I showed you before, when you plot it on the geologic timescales, it's almost a vertical line. So the rate at which we are adding carbon dioxide to the atmosphere is faster than has been seen in the geologic record. And that's quite scary to think about. So why is this carbon dioxide causing the Earth to warm? So this is linked to the greenhouse effect. So we get our energy from the sun's rays, they come in, and when they hit Earth, they change in wavelength. And the greenhouse gases, so that's carbon dioxide, methane, and other gases in the atmosphere, they trap some of that heat. And that's actually a good thing. That means that our Earth is habitable. Without the greenhouse effect, the average temperature on Earth would be minus 18 degrees C. So we'd need significantly different wardrobes if we were living on that planet. But the excess CO2 that we've added to the atmosphere has caused excess warming, and that is what is problematic. So this is a graph of the average global temperature from 1850 till 2020. And it's average global temperature difference. So there's a baseline. So from 1850 to 1900, they took an average temperature, and then they've compared future temperatures to that average temperature over that 50-year baseline. Each little line is 1 year, and these are color-coded relative to temperature change. And what you can see is on the left-hand side of the graph, we have a lot of yellows and blues. And then as we move over to the right-hand side of the graph, this is more yellows, oranges, and reds, indicating that the average global temperature has increased, and it's increasing at an increasing rate. You might also notice that there's a lot of variability along this curve. So there is natural variability, which causes temperature differences globally, but the trend of increasing temperature is overwhelming. And also important to note is this is average global temperature. So there are some places on the planet that are warming faster than this. For example, in the Arctic, warming's up to 3 times as fast as the global average. So what we've seen so far is about a 1.1, 1.2 degrees C warming relative to that 1850 to 1900 baseline. And what I'm always interested in is how much carbon dioxide has been added in my lifetime. I think this is a really interesting figure, but also, quite shocking, I would say as well. So this is created by Neil Kay, who's a scientist at the Met Office. And he calculated how much carbon dioxide has been added in your lifetime. So I am 32, so somewhere in between the 30 band and the 35 band. So more than 50% of the carbon dioxide emissions since 1751 have been added since I've been on this planet. And that's quite shocking. If you're 50 years old, it's 75% of emissions. It's huge. So it's quite shocking because you see how quickly we've added this carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. But in some ways, it also gives me hope, because if 50% has been added during my lifetime, there's hope that we can change the practices that we're having on Earth and turn this around for the next 30 years of my lifetime. So what might the future look like? That's the really big question. And definitely with discussions coming up to COP26, I think that's quite a daunting question for a lot of us. And honestly, the future depends on what we do next. So one of the biggest uncertainties in climate models is actually the emissions scenario, or the conditions that humans will create for the planet. So this links back to, are we going to keep burning fossil fuels, or are we going to use sustainable sources of energy? Are we going to drive to work, or are we going to make sure that trains are affordable and that cycle infrastructure is accessible for as many people as possible? So these graphs are from the most recent report from the International Panel on Climate Change, the AR6, which was recently released. So it looks like a lot of graphs, but I'm going to talk through them, so hopefully it's not too daunting. So on the left-hand side, we've got time on the x-axis, and on the y-axis, we've got warming relative to 1850 to 1900. So that's the same period as I showed you on that colourful graph earlier on. And these different coloured lines across here are different emission scenarios or different conditions that humans will create for our future. And this giant arrow pointing at 1.5 is highlighting the commitments that governments made in Paris to try and limit warming to 1.5 degrees C. And you can see in the most optimistic of scenarios, we can limit global warming to 1.5 degrees C or slightly above that. However, in some of the other emission scenarios where we carry on as we are currently, or a worst case scenario where we increase emissions, warming is going to be between 3.5 and 4.5 degrees C by the end of the century. So that's a lot more warming than we're hoping we'll reach. So on the right-hand side of the graph, on the right-hand side of the screen, sorry, there's another graph which shows the carbon dioxide emissions that are linked to these different pathways. So the colors should match up. So this pale blue one represents this pale blue one on the left-hand side. And essentially, if we're going to limit warming to 1.5 degrees C, we need to start decreasing our carbon emissions as soon as possible. And we need to reach net zero or no emissions by, some no emissions by just after 2050. And after that, we need to be removing more carbon dioxide from the atmosphere than we're putting in. However, if we carry on as we are currently, so this is just a kind of a straight line from where we are at the moment, this is this red scenario. So that corresponds to 3.5 degrees C of warming by the end of the century. And the impacts of those different warming scenarios are significantly different. So some of the impacts, currently we have seen an increase in extreme events, extreme weather and climate events. So you can see on this graph here, it's a bar graph over time, looking at the number of events that have been going on. So in red, you can see that's geophysical. So that's like earthquakes and stuff. They've stayed pretty constant over time, which is what we would expect. However, we've seen an increase in tropical storms, floods, landslides, droughts, and wildfires. And these extreme events are projected to increase both in frequency and in intensity as we move into the future. And these will have impacts globally. So we've seen the UK is susceptible to flooding, and we've seen in Europe there's been terrible flooding this year, and in China. The US are experiencing some really bad wildfires at the moment, and we've just seen Hurricane Ida, which has hit the southern coast of the US. So these impacts will be felt globally. And I think coming back to what we were talking about before about the different emission scenarios, if we can limit warming to 1.5 or 2 degrees C, we really limit the impact of the climate change as well. So it's not just that like for every degree C, you get a proportional amount of impact. The impacts are significantly larger at higher temperatures. So every single bit of carbon dioxide we can keep out of the atmosphere is going to be a better future for everybody. And one thing I want to draw your attention to, especially as health professionals, is heat waves. So at 2 degrees C warming globally, it's estimated that there'll be about 1 billion people who are impacted by heat waves. But if that gets to 4 degrees C, it's 8 billion people. So it's a significant difference between the two different scenarios. One question is, when might we hit this 1.5 degrees C warming that we're aiming for? So this is a tool that's put through the Copernicus Climate Change Service, and it's free and openly accessible. And I can share the link afterwards. So using the trend of current warming, they project that we'll hit 1.5 degrees C if we carry on as we are by March 2034. But they also have the ability that you can turn back time and see how much time you would have had if you'd have started acting earlier. So if we'd have started when I finished my PhD, which is in 2017, obviously we knew about climate change then, we would have had till 2038. And if we'd have started when I finished my undergraduate, where I also learned about climate change, we would have had till 2044. And I think for me, seeing this sliding tool really enforces the fact that we need to take climate action now to limit the CO2 that we're releasing into the atmosphere. And I think when we're doing this, a less scary way to imagine it, for me at least, is to try and imagine a better future for all. So instead of panicking and thinking, how on earth are we going to get this carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere? How can we change what we do? We can start thinking, you know, how can we build our cities in a really positive way so that people can walk to work? There can be more trees, which will really help with cooling urban areas during heat waves and improving air quality. And how can we make sure we preserve natural spaces and give people access to fresh water? And I think encouraging cities to become more green and people to become more able to walk and bike to where they need to go, and changing their diets to be more sustainable, that's a really exciting way to think about the future and less daunting than some of those graphs may have made you feel. So with that, I will say thank you very much, and I will pass back to Heather.
Thank you. And our final speaker for this afternoon session is Rachel Stancliffe. Rachel is founder and director of the Centre for Sustainable Healthcare, one of the world's foremost institutions for sustainable healthcare in research and practice. The CSH develops knowledge and tools to achieve a net zero health service by 2045. Over to you, Rachel.
Thanks very much, Heather. And there we go. Is that okay? Can you see that?
Yes, that's fine.
Great. Okay, cool. Hello, everybody, and thanks very much for having me. This is me in a bluebell wood, and I'm the director of the Centre for Sustainable Healthcare, as Heather said. We've been supporting the NHS largely and other health systems to understand sustainability and carbon since 2008. There's 24 of us now on the team, and we love collaborating with everybody. So very nice to be here today. So carbon literacy, the wonderful Carbon Literacy Project has given us this definition, which is an awareness of the carbon costs and impacts of everyday activities and the ability and motivation to reduce emissions on an individual, community and organisational basis. So this is useful for us. Another way of talking about carbon costs is carbon footprint, and Antony and Rosie have both talked about the carbon footprint. So Mike Berners-Lee, who we've worked with and who I really respect, says it's the best estimate of the full climate change impact of something. He's a very practical person, and I'll talk a bit more about him in a minute. We also have this definition. It's the sum of greenhouse gas emissions which are attributable to a given process, product or organisation. And the 7 greenhouse gases covered by the Kyoto Protocol are which I can go through, with carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide and so on, are usually expressed in carbon dioxide equivalents. So that's when you see CO2e, that's what that means. And of course, being curious humans, we want to know what the different carbon footprint of items are. And Antony's very clearly shown us ways of visualizing that and putting them into the same kind of a comparable kind of way of looking at things. So, you know, we sometimes run these quizzes, but you can also start looking up what the different carbon footprints of things are. And, you know, I was quite surprised by how much a box of eggs is, for example, 2 kilograms, which is much more than a loaf of bread, for example. He's got a great book called How Bad Are Bananas? And I'll show you a picture of it, which I buy for all my staff, and I recommend to you all. And you'll read in that how bad a banana is. It's not bad at all. It's actually very good. It's only 110 grams. But it's also a really good introduction to thinking about carbon footprints in a kind of sensible way. So what he's basically saying is that rough and robust ways of thinking about these things are quite often better than getting very, very detailed. And I'll talk about that in relation to health in a minute. So another thing he said is that you beware of toe prints. So you might sometimes get a part of a print, which is the obvious thing, but actually you might miss out big chunks of what should be measured. So Antony said it's very important for him that he has all the information behind a visualization of something. And of course, being doctors, healthcare professionals, we are very evidence-based. We try and be evidence-based, and so it's important to get the science right. But again, that's not always easy. So average carbon footprint of an individual in terms of a UK citizen, it's about 13 tons a year. Whereas a global citizen average is 7 tons a year. And of course, in some countries, it's much lower than that. We need to reduce that massively to between 1 and 2 tons a year. If we think about carbon for healthcare as a whole, so the whole healthcare system globally, and there's an estimate being done of this by Healthcare Without Harm and Arup, which comes out at 2 billion tons, which is the equivalent of 514 coal power stations, which is big. So if you're trying to get people to say, what's healthcare got to do with this? Has it got anything? You can say, look, this is really big. Actually, our contribution is big. So we need to sort of sort ourselves out. And that's the equivalent of the 5th largest country in the world. We are lucky that we have in this country a really sizable or part of the NHS now, which is looking at sustainability, called the Greener NHS. So within NHS England, and they've grown hugely over the last couple of years. So it's gone from a very small unit with a sustainable development unit to a really big department. And this, I won't go through this in detail, but they have done now quite a detailed carbon footprint of the NHS in England. And they'll be updating that regularly. So I'm going to go back to this definition for a minute, just because we've been talking a lot about data and figures, and this definition includes not only an awareness of the carbon costs and impacts, so that's the kind of date, what is happening, but also the ability and motivation to reduce the emissions. So I think we're all here probably because we want to reduce the emissions and we understand the need for that. But relating one to the other is really important. So one of the reasons that we're trying to understand is obviously not just because we're interested in writing a paper or filling our brain with more numbers. It is because we want to reduce them. So understanding where we are and where we need to get to is really important. So as part of this, as part of the Greener NHS, they've done a trajectory to net zero, which they've broken down. And I really like this diagram because it's these sort of wedges. And again, it's back to how does this become even possible? How can we begin to get a grip on it? So we've got there the things in purple, which are the national grid and so on, which are kind of things outside. Oh, help, sorry. things outside healthcare. And then we've got, you can see here, clinical leadership and, oh, I don't know why it's doing that, sorry. Clinical leadership and then innovation at the bottom. So I'll come on to that in a minute, why that's important. So some of these things are easy. They're not having an impact on healthcare. We can get involved with them as healthcare professionals, and that might be really important. But actually, if we change those, as Antony said with the car, if we change the supplier to a low carbon electricity, then we substantially reduce the carbon impact of that. So there are things that we can do which aren't having actual impact on what we do. But then there's more complex change, and I suppose this is what we've tried to work on over the last sort of 14 years, which is developing sustainable healthcare systems. And we've got these 4 principles of sustainable healthcare, which are prevention, patient empowerment, lean systems, and low carbon alternatives. And you'll note there that that low carbon alternatives is only sort of last on the list in a sense. So we want to stop doing the things that are low value or that we might be able to prevent bad things happening later on in health terms. And we want to involve patients more. We want to reduce waste in the system, and only then do we want to look at low carbon alternatives. So this is a kind of hierarchy in a way, although of course in practice these are all intertwined. So back to this, and I'm using something from 2016. It doesn't really matter. It hasn't really changed that much. So this is how I'm talking about this, because this is how we got engaged with the numbers in the first place. So we looked at this first carbon footprint, which was done in 2008 originally, and then redone every year. And we looked at this, and it was a huge surprise back then, 14 years ago, that in fact, the largest chunk within the healthcare was not in the buildings, which is where everyone was focusing their efforts, but was actually to do with the procurement that was going on in the NHS. So that made us understand that actually clinicians have a really important role to play, because a lot of that procurement is under their care, as it were. It's what they're using. It's not just the building that they're operating in. So that meant that clinicians and medical directors had to work alongside energy managers and estates directors in order to actually change the lion's share of this footprint. And this is another one I think is useful, because a lot of people, when you start talking about carbon footprints, they will, and reducing and sustainability, will immediately think about waste. And actually waste is a tiny percentage on this graph. So you can see here again that pharmaceuticals, medical instruments are massive, and there are some individual hotspots, what we call hotspots, which are big things, well, small things maybe that have a big impact. So inhalers and anesthetic gases, which have been highlighted for reduction. So the other thing then is, if you're working in healthcare, you look at that footprint and you say, oh, well, we're different from that. So we're a bit different, obviously. What are we like? So this is a footprint of cataract surgery, actually, which is very similar really to the overall footprint. But then you say, okay, how could we reduce that? How do you begin to understand how to engage with that footprint back there? So Cassie Teal, who we've worked with over the years, again, did quite a long time ago now, it's published in 2017, but she probably did the work 2 or 3 years before then, went to India and did a comparison between cataract surgery in the UK and India, and found, maybe not surprisingly, but that India had a much lower footprint. What was interesting is that everyone would go, oh, but the outcomes were probably much worse. They weren't. They were totally comparable. So you have a system which uses largely reusable instruments, and their main footprint is actually just the sterilisation of those instruments. So there are some process things that are different, but actually, largely we could do that here in the UK if we tried. And then, of course, footprints differ between specialties. So whereas cataract is, as we've seen, dental services, we did a carbon footprint of dental services in quite a lot of detail. and found out that actually a huge percentage of the footprint was in staff and patient travel. So obviously there are differences within healthcare, and it's interesting to look. So the neuro ICU has had a carbon footprint, and this is somebody's MSc dissertation at Warwick. Don't think it's been written up in a paper yet, but hopefully it will be. So you can see from this actually that the procurement, sorry, which is blue on the other one, but it's green on here, is less proportionally, sorry, for ICU, whereas the energy intensity is higher, and in fact the travel is higher as well. So I'm not quite sure about the travel here, but you can see here the comparison with the overall NHS. Electricity in the normal NHS only 7.5%, but here 25% of the whole. So it's interesting to begin to break down and look in more detail. And this is obviously how we understand things. We look at the bigger picture, and then we kind of come down to a smaller scale and start picking away at bits. And if you get involved in research around this, you'll see that it's not just a kind of really clear standard way of doing carbon footprints. There are different ways of doing footprints for different things. So of course, if you want to look at a certain scale, it's a bit like doing photography or something. You would use one lens, whereas if you're looking at the detail of a flower, you would use a different kind of lens. You can't use the same lens for both things. So again, understanding what is good methodology and a good tools for doing different levels of carbon footprint is part of carbon literacy. So back to why is this all important? And obviously, we all want to reduce carbon emissions. We all want to make this a planet that we can continue to live on. And part of that is putting our own house in order. So that is where we have to understand what we're doing already and change it. We have to model change, show that that's possible, and write those things up as case studies and papers and so on, so that other people can learn from them as quickly as possible. And then we also have to use influence in wider society. So there are a lot of doctors obviously out there, part of XR and House Declares and so on, who are using their standing in the community and their knowledge and their education in order to help to change bigger things in society. But starting with where we are is part of that, understanding with where we are is part of that. If you want to learn more, and sorry, it's been a bit of a run through, quick run through, but if you want to learn more, we do run a carbon footprinting course alongside other courses for healthcare professionals largely, and we'd love to see you on them. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Rachel. That was a brilliant overview of carbon footprinting. Thank you so much. If we open the floor to questions, if I may start with one, how can you create change within your own organisation in terms of moving towards a greener, more sustainable future? Maybe direct at you, Rachel, if that is okay.
How can you create change? First, I suppose, understand what change is possible within where you are. So that's part of sort of understanding your spheres of influence, I would say. Think about where you are on the system and where you have access to. Think about your assets. What are you good at? If you're good at visuals, then try and offer those services to other people who maybe want to work with you. I would always say work with other people, because it can be really difficult doing stuff on your own. And there will be lots of people out there who want to do things with you. So the first thing probably is to find some other people who want to work with you and who you'd like to work with, and make a plan. But like anything, it's kind of, how do you get to the mountain? Look at where you want to go on the mountain, make a plan, draw a map, get some friends, pack your bag. So it's no more difficult than anything else in terms of change. We do have a thing called sustainable quality improvement, which is targeted at healthcare professionals making changes, because if you think about the opportunities for changing clinical pathways, some of that is best done when those things are happening already. So quality improvement, the process around that is a kind of opportunity for change. And so we've got some free resources on a website called susqi.org, which you can look at.
Brilliant, thank you. Heather, over to you. Have you got any questions?
And just to say, I've been popping some of these web links in the chat function, including, I was literally typing that right then, Rachel, when you were saying that, for the SUSQI framework, and I'd highly recommend it. It's a really interesting model that combines sustainability principles into quality improvement for healthcare. And there's lots of quality improvement projects going on at the moment, so I'd encourage you to look into that. Rosie, I'll ask you a question about, could you expand further on what you think the priorities should be that we all take individually to help reduce climate change that will have the biggest impact?
Yeah, it's a big question, because climate change can feel really overwhelming as an individual. And I listened to a podcast recently that I think put it really nicely. So we don't all have to make the same change in our lives. You know, maybe I can fly a bit less, but maybe that's not possible for someone else. Or maybe somebody else can cycle to work, but that's not possible for somebody else. So I think we can all make changes in our own lives to impact our own carbon footprint. But the way that you can make a bigger impact is if you can do anything outside the sphere of just one human. So if you just make a change in your own life and you don't tell anyone and you just do it, then you've only made one small change. But if you tell your friends at work, like Rachel was saying, you might find some like-minded friends at work who want to make a change, or maybe you do something for your community so that multiple people can make that change in their life. I think that's a really cool way to increase the impact that an individual can have on these big challenges. So personally, I haven't got a car anymore. I cycle to work, and I've started eating more plants. And the way that I, share that with other people is, I help people with telling them which bike routes I take to work that I feel safest on. And I try and cook my friends and family delicious vegetarian food so that they find, they're like, oh, okay, that's a cool recipe. Maybe I'll cook that once a week. So yeah, that would be my advice.
Can I add something to that? When we had the consultancy Carbon Sense, we came up with an idea called the Carbon Journey. And that was really in response to a project for BT, which was looking at carbon neutrality, and did that make sense to them? And kind of part of the way through that, I came to this view that kind of carbon neutrality, where you kind of reduce emissions and then you, as much as you can, you do what you can, etc., and then you offset the rest. It seemed to me like that was not really the goal we should be aiming for, laudable though it was. And actually there was something beyond that, which we called carbon positive. And the really important element was to understand what your sphere of influence is. So an organization, as an individual, you might think you've got quite a small sphere of influence, but it's interesting to think about what kind of people you might know, what kind of organizations you interact with, and so on. And for some of the bigger organizations, certainly that we worked with in the past, they had massive spheres of influence, and as a very simple example, the weirdest one probably was working with a Formula One team, Honda Formula One, who just took away all the adverts and stuff from their cars and just had the Earth on the car. It was called the Earth car. I think this was 10 years ago. I don't know if you remember. It was a rubbish car in terms of winning races. But we were asked to look at the whole carbon footprint of the racing team and what that meant and all that sort of thing. And in the end, it was down to, what's your sphere of influence? Well, it turned out that, the 20 million people watched Formula One, and if each of those people, I think, changed one light bulb, it was something like, 6 times the total carbon footprint of Honda Formula One, including, zooming around the world in airplanes and everything like that. So sphere of influence is the thing, and just to try and think about what that could be.
I don't know, you're on mute.
Yeah, thank you. Probably got time for one more question, maybe 2. Question from the audience. Do we need to have a national conversation about healthcare towards the end of life? Truly sustainable critical care is, I suspect, less critical care. And what does the panel make of that? I think it probably feeds back a little bit also into the Centre for Sustainable Healthcare framework you discussed earlier, Rachel, in terms of lean care pathways as well, in terms of how much therapy and investigations we do, and whether all of that really is truly evidence-based. But I can see you've already put a comment there. I don't know whether you want to expand on that a bit further.
Yeah, I'm really passionate about it, because I feel like, I don't know, if we all have a sort of carbon, if we understand that we have a carbon budget, we wouldn't want it to be spent at the end of our lives, and we would want, so if we could spend, for example, I mean, you know, that's not a good example maybe, but, you know, rather than mending a broken leg because you've fallen off your bike on an icy cycle path, which happens all the time, if we could just, you know, grit those cycle paths like we do grit roads, and spend the money upstream, then we could prevent that bad thing from happening. And I just feel very, very strongly that there are lots of things like that we don't spend money on upstream, that we could actually prevent things happening downstream. And I've been going around for 14, 15 years saying, can we do some more study on that? Can we please get some better data on that? Because if we followed those pathways upstream, we would have a better idea of what we think, you know, we know intuitively. But yeah, I think it's, in terms of a conversation, absolutely. I think it would be brilliant to have those conversations. So many people end up on 10 medicines at the end of their lives, some counteracting the side effects of others. And then, you know, in intensive care, as you are, you know, hugely intensive resources. And what is the value of that? And I think some good, robust, open conversations about that would be amazing.
Yeah, so shift the focus over to how can we prevent patients coming to us in the first place. Yeah, indeed. All right, one more question. Tony, if I can direct that to you, please. Are there any particular data visual messages related to climate change that you think are particularly important for healthcare professionals to be aware of, or something you would like working on?
Oh gosh.
Sorry.
Well, you know, anything that could make a difference. If there are sort of numbers that are bandied around that are still just numbers that go in one ear and out of the other, then, you know, we'd love to help, you know, do that. I have to say that over the last couple of years, we've really developed ways to do that which are much faster and take much less time, and therefore, you know, the cost is pretty small. And indeed, for something important, you know, we're happy to help out where we can if there isn't a budget. But I think, yeah, just showing people that this is real and getting that light to change in somebody's brain so that they go, oh my God, you know, we are part of this. I'm part of it. You know, my organization is, how can I make a difference? And just to be able to show that. So I can't think of any particular thing, but if you guys have got some numbers or that you think might fit that bill, then let me know.
Great. Thank you so much, everyone. I think we're coming towards the end of our session today, so I will wrap up. Thank you for joining us today. I hope the audience has found it useful and taken some new knowledge away. Also, a really big thank you to our three speakers. I've really enjoyed talking to you today. Thank you so much. Our next session is next week, Thursday, instead of Tuesday. And we'll look at the impact of climate change on health, but also the economic and health co-benefits on acting on climate change. And you will hear from two of our expert speakers from the Lancet Countdown, Professor Hugh Montgomery and Dr. Frances McGuire. Looking very much forward to seeing you next week. Thank you very much for coming.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone.